Hello and welcome to this special episode of Hello and welcome to this special members only episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Today we're continuing our core questions where once a month we kind of go into one of the deeper questions that I think is at the heart of so much what we talk about on this podcast. And it's going to be about who decides what has meaning and what is the meaning of a show. A lot of times we like to talk about, how different people can interpret different things in different ways. And while in general, I think we really have an openness to that, I think that sometimes it's easy for any of us, myself included, to try and make claims about what we think the author really meant. And sometimes that's based on actual facts, and sometimes it's based on assumptions and all these different things. And we want to kind of dive into that issue. And this is not entirely based on discussions about Andor and things like that, but it is inspired by a conversation that Riki had on one of our recent episodes, where I made a comment about my understanding of what Andor was about and what different scenes were referencing. And Riki, I think, rightly pushed back a bit and said that might be my interpretation, but not necessarily everybody's. And so we wanted to kind of get into this issue and talking about what it means, because I think that, and Riki, please jump in with, because I think that, and this is Riki kind of giving me my starting place and let me know where you are. I feel like as we look at this question, there's a danger of going to either of two extremes. On the one hand, I think we get into real problems if we start trying to say, we know exactly what the author was trying to say. And I mean, sometimes we do have statements from the author about what the author did or didn't mean. But even then, I think that there is room for what we interpret and what we see in the media itself. But on the other hand, I think if we just say like every story has the meaning it has to whoever is talking about it, we live in a world where a lot of people have some pretty bad faith takes. And a lot of times people's interpretation is either they've decided what they're going to feel about it going into a work, or they are acting on just what they've been told by other people, which again is inspired by bad faith in some way or another, or there is a level of misunderstanding or missing details. Do you think that's kind of a fair starting place, so that we have to be a little careful of both of those extremes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and I have talked in the past about certain anime like Gundam,
Mm-hmm.
which has a lot of fascist imagery and elements to it. And I've talked to you about the fandom and how some people react. And
Right.
I do think it's important to recognize A, what the creators say about their
Mm-hmm.
work, like what they actually say, not what we are interpreting through their works
Right.
in interviews or whatnot, because that is, I mean, fundamentally, that's just truth, right? If they tell us that this was their intention when they did this, that's their truth.
Right.
Certainly, as the audience, as fans, we can interpret things that way. We
Mm-hmm.
can interpret them differently, or it can mean something different to
Right.
us than what the author, the creator intended. And that is a reflection on ourselves, our own journeys, where
Right.
what we have experienced in life. And that's important too. I think that's an important part of art
Right.
in general, right? Is how it makes us feel
Yeah.
is just as important as what the artist intended when they created the art. I mean, to us, like I think to
Mm-hmm.
the artists themselves, they don't care what we necessarily think, right? They may have an intention, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes art can get away from the creator.
Right. Well, and sometimes that can be very different of the creative mind, and the business mind may have different ideas about what they want the
Mm,
audience to say, and how those
sure.
things interact and all that. And I
Maybe there's a third, yeah, the third agent in all of this is the studio, I guess,
right,
to say it broadly,
the
and what
commercial.
they intend.
And I want to just start with there with that what you were saying, because I think especially as I listened back to our argument there and thought more about it, I realized that I think I was falling a little bit too much into the like the author has the final say about what something means, because I do think, as you said, it's very important to know what the author has to in say. And I think sometimes like a lot of times we can misunderstand what an author is saying, in part because we don't understand the context in which they're writing or the context in which they are acting out of. But what you said there about how our different meanings, the different ways it strikes us, still has meaning. Um, I don't want to get too deep into philosophy, but this is exactly what postmodernism is very much about, and that was kind of what my graduate level like education was very much rooted in. And postmodernism basically being the idea that like a work of art, a media, it actually starts as a discussion of architecture, but now can be expanded to all things, doesn't really have any inherent meaning outside of the person observing it. That there's a relationship created between any person who is, examining or watching or experiencing the work of art, and the meaning is the meaning that they construct with it as they observe it. And I think that is a school that I, for the most part, fall very much into. And I think it's exactly what you were talking about there, that there are, and that sometimes it can be unintentional by the author, that, that there are times when authors have used imagery coming out of Japanese history or anime or things like that without really fully understanding what they mean, but that gives it meaning to you and to other people with those backgrounds. As a disabled person, there are times where I see meanings that I fully know were not intended in any way by the author, but are very much there for me, sometimes positive and sometimes negative, or sometimes just somewhere in the middle. And while, again, I think there's an extreme to go to that's problematic, I think this is a really good starting place of we can talk about what the author meant, and that is important, and there is factual elements to that, and especially, as you said, when the author is either telling us pretty directly in the work or is just literally confirmed it in their own words, but that doesn't have to be the end-all be-all of what something actually means.
Right. So here, if it's okay with you, I've pulled up a very specific question in an interview with Tony Gilroy. And this is from the website AV Club.
Mm-hmm.
And the question goes, one final question. It's the last one in the interview.
Is this going to involve a spoiler from Andor Season 2? Because if so, we should just give a spoiler warning.
Yes. I mean, this is broadly touching on what we talked about regarding Gorman.
Okay. So yeah. So this is about, if there's some elements that you probably are expecting to happen in Season 2, especially if you've seen Rebels. But if you don't have any idea what we're talking about, especially when we say the word Gorman, then maybe again pause and watch Season 2 of Andor, Season 1 Andor, Season 2, and then come back to this. But with it, we'll try not to go into any direct spoilers that are too specific. But we'll probably mention some things because
the reference itself broadly gives you an idea of what is taking place. Is what I would say in terms of the least spoilery way I can say it.
Go ahead.
So it's one final question. What is your reaction to people who attach specific real-world parallels to moments from the show, Andor? I'll be honest and say I couldn't not think about Gaza during some of the moments on Gorman. Mm-hmm. And Tony Gilroy's answer to this is, you've already answered this question earlier on. I'll put it on Mike Duncan. You listened to Revolutions, which is a podcast that they referenced earlier in the interview. How many moments are there just like this that are constantly? How many different people could say, quote, oh, that's mine. That belongs to me. This is my issue. What's really exhausting about this question, I guess what's terrifying about it as well, is it's a party that so many people can host. I'm not going to make the list because making a list just puts me in more trouble. Mm-hmm. You could find so many different places to put this and say, this belongs to me. I'm hoping to make something, always trying to make work that isn't disposable. I'm always trying to make stuff that people can go back and look at again. It's not a one-time use, and it's very pleasing to come up with material that has a timeless quality that it's going to speak to so many people. I'm rambling, but I'm really trying to say what I've been saying for the last 5 weeks, which is that it's very sad the amount of times that this has happened in history that people could choose to say this belongs to me. And I think we can see probably, I mean, this is interpretation, right? My interpretation when he says making a list just puts me in more trouble does feel like a little bit of a studio, or a company saying, hey, don't talk about this current event. And he's kind of like making a nod to that. But I think what he is saying in general speaks to the work, is that I think if a work like Star Wars, like Andor, makes a direct reference to something happening now or like in recent history, then it loses some of that quality that he's talking about. And you mentioned it in our previous discussion that George Lucas, in an interview, did directly state that the rebellion was based on the Viet Cong.
Right.
And we further learn, like a lot of the imagery of Yavin and the jungle is to evoke that, their uniforms, etc. And so like that is something we can directly say, like George Lucas meant this because he's told us that. But if you just watch Star Wars, A New Hope, I don't think you come out of it going, oh man, that was just like the
Yeah.
Vietnam War. It could be so many war. It could be so many rebellions, right? And I think that's what Tony Gilroy is trying to say here is like, if you draw this lesson, that is
Right.
something that you can do, but it's sad that so many people can draw historical parallels to what I depicted on the screen. And it has happened. Like I've been watching people say like, oh, this reminds me of this massacre that the British Empire inflicted on Indians. This reminds me of a student protest in Mexico in 1968 against the Olympics in Mexico City. And that one actually, there's the evidence now that has been revealed shows that a certain thing happened in that incident that does seem to parallel with the show, which I will not say specifically, but we don't know. Like I've tried to find like any reference Gilroy has made to that in Mexican incident, and it's not there currently. Maybe in a future interview we'll ask him.
I think one of the only direct references he's confirmed is that the people of Gorman and their resistance to the empire is that he had in his mind. One of the things he had in his mind was the French resistance to the Nazis during World War II. And the Gorman language is phonetically it sounds a lot like French, and a lot of the actors who play Gormans are French speakers themselves. And you're right, and there's lots of different references like that. There's a slogan that the people use that is with one word changed, very much taken from a student that American students were using in the 1960s, particularly in 1968 when the police rioted outside the Chicago Democratic Convention. And I love his quote because I do think you're right. I think there's a certain level of he's saying, I can't tell you exactly what was on my mind. A, because I just want to let the work speak for itself, which I think is a fair statement for an artist to make. But also because, and I don't want to interpret this as just the way I want to see it, could mean anything. But that, if he gets too specific, it's going to start discussions it doesn't necessarily want to start in terms of people saying, oh, but how could you frame it as this conversation, or why didn't you frame it as this other conversation, etc. And just to further highlight the point that you're talking about, I think this is why, to me, it's so important to ask ourselves what is the context in which writers are creating things. And in my graduate school, we were looking at that especially because, we want to look at, okay, when you have this letter from Paul to the people of Rome in the Bible, what was actually happening in Rome that Paul is referencing that we might forget when we look at that work 2,000 years later? And as a great example of what you're talking about, one of the things the professor mentioned was a study, and I heard this 20 years ago, I don't remember the exact numbers, but he talked about how when people watched the show MASH in the 1980s and 90s, especially I think when people watched the show MASH in the 1990s and they were asked about it, what war is this about? They said the Korean War. But when they did polls of people who watched it when it came out, they all said it was about the Vietnam War. Because a show that came out in the late 1970s about the futility of Americans trying to fight a communist insurgency and all these kind of things, yes, they said it in Korea, but everyone who was watching it was very clear that they were talking about Vietnam and they were making commentary on Vietnam. But 20, 30 years later, people have forgotten that and they see it as what it most directly is about, which is Korea. And so, yeah, I think that this should kind of further underline the point you're talking about, which is that, the author's leaving a lot up to interpretation, but also in terms of understanding their interpretation, we're not going to get it in the same way as the people who watch it at the same time or are coming from the same context.
Yeah, he mentions the word timeless.
Yeah.
And I think that does speak to what you just said about MASH, because this show will continue to exist. People will watch it. Let's say they watched it in 20 years. Right. And unfortunately, there will probably be other massacres and genocides in the world. And it's very possible that in 20 years time people will say, ah, like this show's about this.
Right.
And obviously it won't be, because like that's not how time works.
Right.
But the fact that a historical allegory, a lesson can be drawn even in the future is the power of it, right? And why I
Right.
think he wants to distance himself from like it is specifically about a thing.
Right. And I think that's where the conversation becomes important because, yeah, MASH is at the end of the day, MASH is about the futility and the ridiculousness of war, and the existence of people whose job it is to save lives in the midst of a world that is trying to end lives and trying to tell them that saving these lives are important and these lives aren't. And I do think in the same way, this Andor is about fascism. It's about power. It's about authority. And it's about how those things are expressed. And while I think there are modern day questions that the show is, for me at least, very clearly commenting on, I think you're right that I'll just name it directly. Like I watched that show, and I saw what felt like a lot of direct references to Gaza. And yes, it is true. A lot of the show was written before things in Gaza got to the point that they've gotten at. But certainly, I think the situation there has not been like great and wonderful until October 6th of a couple of years ago. Um, but I think to me, it's the kind of more of the question of like this show is talking about a universal situation that occurs in both fiction and nonfiction, but also when it makes references, like the fact is that right now we live in a world where Gaza, a lot of people disagree as to whether it fits that particular pattern of genocide and brutality and all these kind of things. And so for me, I think there's importance in saying, for a lot of us, watching this further confirms what we see in Gaza as part of this pattern. But you're right, it's not to go therefore to say that Tony Gilroy is specifically saying Gaza is one of the situations he's talking about. I think there's real room to interpret it as that, but to make that a definitive statement, there is no evidence for that.
Yeah. And that is what I was pushing back on, to be
Yeah,
clear, is like explicitly saying like this is about Gaza. I
right.
think your interpretation is a valid one. I think I agree with many elements of it. And even more so, like the way that they depict news in the
Mm-hmm.
show is very striking, because the Imperial news tells a completely different story from the truth, like what we
Right.
as the audience know to be the truth. And that's part of like we have a certain omniscience as
Right.
the audience. We see what's actually happening, and then we see the news lying about the situation on Gorman. And that doesn't, to me, that doesn't mean all news lies.
Right.
But I do think it means that we should be careful how we integrate our information,
Mm-hmm.
especially in this modern world where the internet like provides us with news instantaneously. And we've seen so many instances of actual like fake incidents like going viral,
Mm-hmm.
and then an hour or two later it's like, oh, that wasn't what happened at all.
Right. The spinning of the facts, or like who gets to determine who was a freedom fighter and who was a terrorist, which I think is
Yeah.
another question essential to this whole season. Yeah, and all that is there's so much spin on every side. With those
And
kinds of
it's
things.
often like the phrase history is written by the winners,
Yeah.
right, is a phrase that we often hear. I don't know if that's true anymore.
Mm.
I think history now is being written by just like whoever writes it first.
Right.
And oftentimes like that actually is what leads to the result of them winning, quote unquote, kind of
Right.
in the public perception sphere.
Well, I would even go as to say that part of it is that we have moved from it where the question is who is writing history to the question of who is creating history.
Yeah.
And I think there's always been propaganda in history, absolutely. But you're right that now often it's the whatever group has the more power over who gets to see what stories and stuff like that becomes very significant.
Yeah, how
And it's
quickly, like how far it spreads.
right to shape the narrative in those ways.
Hmm.
Let me though go back to kind of where we were starting from and ask you a further question because, as you said, you think that for the most part, like not having things that are too direct references to exact situations is something you generally prefer. To me, the thing that I think is the most clear, here's a specific moment in history that's been repeated often, but is happening right now that they are discussing. And this is a spoiler for the first couple episodes of the season 2, but I think it's a pretty light one, but it's an important plot point. Our heroes have fled to a new planet where it is primarily a farming planet, and they are farm workers who are undocumented. And
Hmm.
that I'm not interpreting that as, oh, they have a document. People talk about them as being vulnerable to the whims of the authorities because, because they are undocumented, and that it is very much kind of again at the whim of the authorities that for a long time tolerated them, but when they decide they don't like them anymore, all of a sudden they want to crack down on these undocumented people, undocumented farm workers. That to me feels like you have to kind of have your head in the sand to not think he is directly commenting on the U.S. immigration system. And well, yes, Trump has only been in power. This was all written long before Trump was in power, but it was written after the first time Trump was in power, when a lot of these same anti-immigrant farm worker mentalities were there. Did that strike you as a little too on the nose?
I do think it's on the nose. I would just, I I agree with you very much in general,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the specificity, the specificness,
Mm-hmm.
if the specificness of it being a U.S. issue or a Trump issue, I think is where I start to kind of pull back,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously you and I live in the United States, so we're much more aware of this situation.
Right.
But I follow a lot of world news, and in Europe, like there are issues of immigrants, documentation, like
Mm-hmm.
are there too many immigrants? Like these are issues that are driving politics in many countries. And I think that yes, like it is very easy to draw a line to
Right.
US immigration situations, but my caution is that the picture is a lot bigger.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I would argue back that a lot of those other nations' drive towards anti-immigrants are very inspired by Trump. But obviously, it's not entirely that. It's easy to have an America-centric view of this. I think that's very true. I
Yeah, well, I mean, from a historical perspective, there's a lot of documentation and research about how Nazi Germany was inspired by the United States,
Yep.
in its use of just racism
Yep.
to drive wedges and to other people.
Long before
So
the
like
death camps, the some of the first anti-Semitic rules that were put down in Nazi Germany were basically exact copies of the Jim Crow laws, where it started being about
yeah,
like who can
yeah,
sit there on
exactly.
buses and who can be in what professions and all that kind of stuff.
And yeah, that's where I'm like I don't I don't for me I don't want to give all this power,
Mm-hmm.
the singular power to the man Trump.
Right.
Like he is very powerful. He's the president of the United States currently. He has a lot of influence on the world, on
Mm-hmm.
politics. But to me, like the lessons of authoritarianism is that they often inspire each other,
Right.
and each authoritarian country like pushes a limit, and then the others go, oh, they did that, like we can push a little farther here.
Right. And I guess that's where I think for me, you're pushing on that the last time we talked really helped me flip a switch because I think for me, where I want to take the conversation is less about, oh, look, this is what Gilroy meant, therefore this is what we should believe, but instead is about we experience it today in that context, and here are some ways that I'm not going to tell people they're right or wrong, but that I think we should, that I'm going to strongly encourage people allowed to color their readings of those real world situations. Like, for example, to me, if you watch this show and you sympathize with the Bix and Brazio, Bix and Brazo and all of them and Cassian as those farm workers undocumented, and still think that what this country or what other countries are doing to immigrants is a-okay, I'm going to say I think you may have missed the point, or there may be like a
Yeah.
disconnect there between how
Yes.
you're understanding things. And I think that to me is a much more interesting way the conversation can go. And just like, yeah, I can say like, yeah, Lucas did mean this, and Gilroy did have some statements about what it does or doesn't mean. But you're right that I think that to me is a more interesting conversation we can have of like,
A-
hey,
Absolutely.
how are you viewing these things?
Yeah. Not that this story is like pointing a finger at a Trump
Right.
or other similar figures. Change the focus of the lens and say, look at what this story is telling us about immigrants,
Right.
about these people, like other than Cassian. Like Cassian is obviously at this point a rebel and
Right.
a criminal in the eyes of the Empire. But on this planet, Bix, Brasso, and Wilmon are just there to work as
Yep.
mechanics or farm workers. Like they're just trying to help. And the most powerful scene to me in that arc was when Brasso is captured
Mm-hmm.
by the Imperials. And forgive me, forgive me, I've forgotten the name, but the local guy who they're friends with and they're working for,
I
right?
think it's Declan, Mr. Declan.
Yeah. Um, he is there as well. And Brasso recognizes the situation and what's happening and intentionally says something like, you bastard, like you sold us out, to
Right.
distance himself from him. Like in
Right.
in that moment, like he's trying to protect his friend because he knows like if it comes out that his friend has been helping them hide here, like he's gonna get in trouble too. And it's a sad situation. And
Right.
it moved me a lot.
I think that's a great example also because it allows me to transition into kind of one of the other parts of this because, and I'll say I was guilty of it. I, for whatever reason, I was a little distracted when I was watching that part. I'm not sure. But I did not realize that the first time I watched it. I came away thinking that Brazo actually believed that these people had turned him in.
Yeah, yeah.
And you and I talked about it. And actually, I think it was actually the people on the my co-host on
Yeah, I
Star Wars
think I
Generation.
think Alex mentioned it.
Yeah, Alex and Aaron, but Alex especially helped call it out. And I think that's the kind of, to me, that's where we talk about the flip side of, yes, the author doesn't have final interpretation. Your experience with the material has its meaning for you, but that it is fair to talk about, like, not that there's a true right reading, but there can be wrong readings. There can be times where we, whether intentionally or because of our own ignorance or just because, we're distracted by a butterfly or whatever it is, we misunderstand something. And it is helpful to clarify, wait a minute, in the story, these are the signs we are given that your reading of this is not accurate to the media.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I completely understand like how you could interpret that way
Mm-hmm.
the what Brasso says, and I think it's just like how good the acting is in that
Yep.
moment. Like they exchange a glance. It's a subtle, it's not like a overt
Yeah.
wink, right? But they just exchange a look. And it is still up to interpretation what that
Right.
look means and whether like he understands what he's doing and is doing it intentionally to help his friend. I choose to interpret it that way, and I think that's what that look means. Again,
Right.
like if the actors or the director tell us, like, yeah, like we filmed it multiple ways, and like this is what we chose because we wanted him to mean this. That's one thing, but I think it's a very powerful moment because of that and because
Right.
it's acted so well and it's so subtle. Because like obviously he doesn't want the Empire to realize like a wink wink, right?
Yeah.
So he has to act in that way. And I think it's consistent with Brasso's character from season one when Andor, remember in the very first episode, Andor comes to him and he's
Mm-hmm.
like, basically, he's like, I need an alibi. Like, I was with you last night. And then he continues to help him develop that
Build that
story.
alibi. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the parallel I drew is like, he's
Yeah.
always done this to help his friends.
And I think that's, yeah, it is literally, I just looked away for a second. I missed that look.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think a lot of misreadings happen that way. But I do think, and I'm not saying this is to other people, I've been guilty of this myself. Sometimes we misread things because it's hard for us to see what's really there, either because of our own projections, our own biases, or things like that. And I'm not going to go into the specifics, but if you listen to one of our most recent, the superhero ethics episode that Riki and I did about the character of Cyril, there's another figure in the Empire who comes to an end that you and I both thought it was pretty clear that they just have this realization that they are going to be destroyed by the same system they were working within.
Yeah.
But that there have been some folks online who take it as that person has a moment of moral awakening because they just don't want that person to be, no, actually just a fascist to the end. And that's where I think, like, because again, I don't want to be in a world of being like, your reading of this is wrong. But I think it has to be some room of saying, like, that is a real stretch from the text. Like, and that it does feel like in moments like that, or especially in a lot of the other moments, people can talk about, where they look at, like, one character's treatment by women and just only want to see, like, oh, they were treated badly by women and therefore nothing is their fault. It feels like we're projecting some misogyny or some sexism or some things like that, And I don't know. I think I'm naming all this because I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there's I think there's a danger in saying I know exactly what the author meant, but I also think there's a danger in saying whatever you say is your interpretation is right, because there are times where people are literally missing what's in the text, either because of distraction or the most benevolent of reasons, or sometimes for not great reasons.
I mean, you want big misses. Like initially in that scene you're talking about, I missed that the character was diegetically listening to Nemec's manifesto because I was kind of in the other room cooking and just listening. So I didn't realize like he was listening to an actual recording. I
You just
thought it
thought
was
we were
just
getting this.
I thought the manifesto was just like being repeated to us to remind
It
us,
was like
and
a part of the soundtrack for us to listen.
yeah.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned this in a conversation, it's like no, like he literally like turns off the recording and turns to the other character and talks
Yeah.
about it. Like, oh, I missed that.
Yeah. No, and that's totally fair. In our ADHD world, it's sometimes hard to get all these things. And
Yeah.
I think that gets into another related question. Here, I do want to move out of the Star Wars realm and talk about the
How
movie
dare
Joker.
you?
I know, but to talk about the movie Joker, because
Oh gosh.
I think that again, the author's intent matters, and hearing about the
Yeah.
author's intent matters. But there
Yeah.
are times when I think that there's a certain responsibility of an author of, if you're trying to be subtle, you still have to be clear enough that people get it. And there's a lot of debate over the movie Joker because there are an awful lot of people who watch that movie and think the movie is making a hero out of Joker. And some see that as, yeah, they should, because, the poor misunderstood white guy in our world. And some are like, that makes it a terrible movie because of that reaction. And my understanding is that the filmmakers have given some indications that they were trying to do this as a parody, that they were trying to do a, like, look how ridiculous this is. And you can say it's either utter genius or utter, misresponsibility. They're so subtle about it that a whole lot of people missed it. And that's where I think the kind of question about, like, author intent does have to match up with what do we think the actual meaning of it is, because I do think that there's something problematic if you are trying to tell a story that is critical of something, but you do it so subtly that an awful lot of people miss that. And, like, we can again say, like, are they missing it because of their ignorance and their deliberate attempt to misread it? Are they missing it because of your failure to make it clear? That's a hard question, but I do think there's these are other things we need to consider.
And then making a sequel that is like directly basically calling out the misreading and going in the complete opposite direction to be like, no, really, like this is
Yeah.
what is, and pissing off all of the fans of the first one is just amazing. I it's fascinating to me.
Well, to me, another great example of that is Dune. I don't know if you read the Dune novels, but there's the first major novel, and then there's kind of a short story, short novella that comes after it. And because the author was very clear that he does not want Paul to be a hero, he wants it to be a story of the person that we think is a hero, actually that it's a cult of personality, and this is why those things are terrible. And a lot of people didn't get that. And the second book could basically be called, No, Paul was really a bad person. Because it's just about, like, the horrible, religious wars that Paul starts, in which billions and billions of people die. And Frank Herbert was very clear. He said, I wrote this because people misunderstood what I meant, and so I wanted to make it clear. So at least the Joker people are following good footsteps there.
Yeah. The Because at the end of the second Dune movie,
Mm-hmm.
he's definitely like, yeah, let's go kill some people. Let's
Right.
go genocide, do some genocide.
And the
Which is
Zendaya,
missing from the David Lynch version.
yeah, David Lynch
I
is a
think that's
straight up
part of the
hero.
misinterpretation aspect is like
Yeah.
that movie just ends with like a heroic celebration. It's like, yeah, we did it. The Fremen
Yeah.
liberated Dune. Don't
And then
don't
the
worry
rain
about
starts
what
falling
happens next.
for no reason whatsoever. And yeah, and I think it's they emphasize it more in the second movie of the new version, but
Yeah.
also that's part of why the Zendaya character is so different because in the book she's by his side, but she breaks with him in what I think is a brilliant understanding of this of in order to get the audience to understand a perspective, you have to have a character who holds that perspective who the audience can
Yeah,
side with.
yeah.
And that's a whole other question, but I think it's actually a great way of addressing this. Of they kind of realized we need to give the audience a reason to say, yes, Paul is wrong. Paul has become a problem. Paul has become exactly actually he wasn't wrong. He's become exactly what he feared he would become. And having that other character played by Zendaya, call him out allows the audience to get on board with that.
Yeah. I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big thing about a lot of these, we'll call it misinterpretations, is that you can't you can't make the bad guy too cool,
Yeah.
right? Like that's kind of what's going. Like Fight Club is a
Mm-hmm.
similar thing where people identify with the Tyler Durden character
Yep.
because like Brad Pitt is good looking and he's cool and he plays like a fun character. It's like, yeah, I like that guy. And like you kind of just don't do like a deeper interpretation of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And like the Edward Norton character is in the movie like depicted as like less cool
Yeah.
than Brad Pitt.
Yeah. Which
And this
which
goes
makes
all the
sense.
way back. Like I'm gonna take it back to Star Wars, right? Like Darth
Mm-hmm.
Vader is really cool.
Yeah.
Growing up, like I love Darth Vader. I still do, as a character.
Mm-hmm.
But the more you learn, the more things we get in Star Wars, it's like, nah, he's just a
Right.
really bad guy, and you have to be able to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Like my fave is a problematic is a
Mm-hmm.
good phrase to
Yeah.
remember,
Very
or
much
my
so. And
fave is problematic.
just as an aside, I think the Dune example and there's another example. The Dune example and the Fight Club example, I think, are good times where sometimes the subtlety of someone not being actually a good guy comes through on paper a lot better than it does on film, and you kind of have to be more extreme. Because again, like if I read something, I'm not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
seeing Brad Pitt. I'm not necessarily seeing Timothy
right.
Chalamet. But once it gets onto the film, then you have to be a little more careful. And I think that's where Joker kind of fails. Um, Pulling it back
Yeah,
though,
because we've danced around like we are gonna cover like rom-coms, kind of
yeah,
like veer to that territory, and that also has been like one of my realizations, like awakenings,
mm-hmm,
is how many male rom-com protagonists are not good people. Like,
mm-hmm,
gosh, I love You've Got Mail, but Tom Hanks' character is terrible,
yeah,
but he gets away with it because he's Tom Hanks.
mm-hmm. Well, and I would even say that there's now an interesting moment in history happening where there's kind of an acknowledgement of that, of like it's not just oh we're gonna pretend these people are good people, but like 'cause to me like Anakin Skywalker is a classic example of a rom com hero who's actually a schmuck.
Oh yeah.
Because like people romanticize his relationship with Padme, and I see him as a stalker. I see him as
Yeah.
like victim, as being like, oh, how could you wear that dress? You kissed me once, and that was unfair. Like I'm like, red flag city. But now, especially with like a lot of the kind of romance fantasy books that are coming out, that are kind of like the modern bodice rippers, but with a lot more intentionality behind them. I think there's a lot more of an acknowledgement of like, yeah, these are terrible men, but they're sexy as hell, and we want them as our rom com, our problematic faves. And that's a whole other topic that we'll definitely try to get Mandy or someone else in with us to discuss. Let me pull us back to this question because we talked about how something like MASH or even like Star Wars, when you're not watching it in the original context, something can be missed.
Hmm.
So okay, so we've talked about how like there are things like the farm worker thing or like the way the genocide is portrayed that feel to us right now very indicative of certain situations, but are not necessarily only about those things, even if they are maybe not even about those things. Um, Hopefully, people are still talking about these shows 30, 40, 50 years from now. Today, we're often reminding people, hey, remember, George Lucas wrote this immediately after the end of the Vietnam War. You know, the Americans pulled out in 73. The Vietnamese government fell completely to North Vietnam in 75. The movie comes out in 77.
Hmm.
And a lot of people today watching it don't necessarily have those dates lined up.
Yeah.
I only know it because it came out the year I was born, so I immediately think of it in those terms. Do you think that while not saying, hey, Gilroy was talking about Mexican American farm workers in America, or Gilroy was talking about Gaza, that it can still be helpful to say, hey, if we're really going to look at Andor 30 years in the future, it's important to remember here was the immigration situation happening in the country that Gilroy was writing in, and also was happening around the world. Hey, it's important to understand here's the history of the genocides and the many things that are referenced in that. And also, at the time that Gilroy wrote this, there was big debate over whether we should use the word genocide to describe what was happening in Gaza, which one
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
characters makes a very big deal about building up to saying that specific word. And it's a word that, like in our own world, we've been begging liberal politicians to use to describe what's happening there. Do you think that it's fair to, again, say, not that we're saying necessarily that Gilroy meant this specifically, but it helps you understand this to know the context that was happening when it was written?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Like it was a very powerful moment
Mm-hmm.
when the character said the word genocide
Right.
regarding a fictional Star Wars planet. But even in the Star Wars canon, I don't think it's been referenced that way. Previously, it's been referenced as a massacre,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing to me is like I see these discussions regarding the Star Wars situation. People are like, well, why did they change it from massacre to genocide? Right?
Mm-hmm.
The wording. It's I don't want to like diminish the situation of like what happens in real life in these tragic
Right.
situations, but they are both tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, like genocide is more of a legal slash historical definition of
Right.
something. And there's not like a line where you go, if it's 1,000 people dead, it's a massacre. If it's 1,001, it's genocide, or like
Right.
percentage of population. Like that doesn't matter. Like it matters for the future, for
Yeah.
history, for how things are written and like how we define things. But in the moment, like who gives a S?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you call it a massacre or a genocide, I think that is drawing the attention away from the actions itself and the tragedy of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is important to talk about these things and not just lump it as saying like it's a genocide, and then that allows people to just dismiss what you're saying because they don't believe it's a genocide, right?
Right.
But if you talk about it and say like, look, like this is what's happening on the ground, like this is how many people have died
Mm-hmm.
in this situation, have been killed in this situation, that I think that grounds things
Right.
in a discussion in a way that like these broad categories don't.
I I don't want to get too much into debate over the specific use in our own world today because I think you and I disagree a lot in that regard. I think it is very important to use that particular word. I guess more what I was talking about though was it's the kind of like I don't want to assume that the author meant something very specific, but I also don't want to assume that the author is completely ignorant of the context of the time in which they're writing. And I guess what I'm
Yeah.
saying is, I think it's fair to say that it's going too far to say Gilroy meant Gaza. But I do think that for Gilroy to choose, Gilroy is aware that he is living at a time when there's a lot of debate over whether the word genocide should be applied to this specific
Yes.
situation,
Yeah.
as well as to others. Like there's a long debate about what happened in Armenia at the end of World War One, and if that should be a genocide or not, or some other situations like that. Um, and yeah, that's my only point. Is I feel like in 30 years, I might want to remind someone at the time Gilroy was writing his choice of Mon Mothma, as part of naming that a situation is worse than people think, is using a word that in the own world at that time was very fiercely debated over whether or not you could apply it to a situation that kind of has a lot of similarities to Gorman, that's important for understanding the show, is kind of really all I was saying.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think in general I agree with your position, like, on what is happening, that it's
Right.
genocide. My position is that if you and I get in an argument with someone about whether or not it is a genocide, that's
Yeah.
just words. That's just semantics,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't need to be right or wrong on that.
Right. I'm not sure I fully agree there, but I think that's kind of a different issue that we can get into at another point. But I definitely hear where you're coming from there.
Yeah, like it's a difficult situation, and I think, like, if there are, like I said, like, from a legal standpoint, if there are international organizations that are
Right.
seeking to have it defined as genocide or war
Mm-hmm.
crimes or whatnot, like, those are important issues to
Right.
fight on the international legal stage.
Right.
Um,
At least I would say this, and tell me if this is kind of a summation of where I think you're coming from. I have seen debates about Gaza, but also about Armenia, about other things, where there is this kind of discussion of whether or not you call it a genocide also means whether or not you call it good or bad. And where my
oh,
comment wants to be,
yeah,
I think genocide applies, but even if you don't call it genocide, it's still a massacre of
yeah, yeah,
tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people. And that, yeah. So in that regard, I do very much where you're coming from.
yeah. Like I think I didn't name it earlier, but the Tlatelolco
Mm-hmm.
massacre is the one that took place in Mexico in 1968. And the estimates are the death toll is 300 to 400 people, as low as 44.
Right.
But most scholars seem to agree there's several hundred,
Right.
and it's called a massacre. And, like, it's ultimately it's a tragedy, and the way that it took place was very problematic in that it was like, it was a peaceful protest, and
Yeah.
the government forces, like, instigated a riot. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's now evidence that they instigated a riot,
Yeah.
to basically force the situation, and seemingly to just be able to justify the murder
Right.
of the protesters, right? And that's, like, the situation that the Star Wars thing seems to somewhat be based on.
Right.
And that's quote unquote only several hundred people, right? But it's still an immense tragedy. It's an overreach of government power.
I mean,
And that's where I am, is like the lessons to draw.
yeah.
It's like, it's not, to me, it's not about, like, the scale, but
Mm-hmm.
it is about the overreach.
Well, I think it also goes to what you were saying before about who writes the history and who writes the press at the time, and also therefore the
Yeah.
history that's based on, is what words do you get to use? And it's massacre or genocide or killing, but also it's freedom fighters or peaceful protesters or terrorists or anything like that.
And the
Um,
fact that there was a lot of cover up, and it is
yeah,
only, like, decades later that the Freedom of Information Act, like, because the U.S. was also, like,
yeah,
heavily involved in this operation, like, supporting the Mexican government. And so, like, thank goodness, like, that these terrible situations have so much documentation, I guess, is what I'm saying.
I mean,
Because otherwise we may never know.
I have this distinct moment of one of the first times I feel like I was aware of the framing of history, because I grew up in New York City and I spent a lot of time in New England, and my father was really into history, and so we often went to historical sites, and so we often talked about the different parts of the American Revolution that happened in those areas. And so I heard about, from a very young age, the Boston Massacre, where the British
Mm,
troops fired into a civilian crowd and massacred people.
yeah,
And so when I found out, do you know how many people were killed in the Boston Massacre?
less than 100.
Five.
Okay. Okay,
Five
well, that makes
people were
sense also,
killed.
because muskets.
Yeah, it's muskets, and
Yeah.
still, it is the government troops firing at unarmed civilians. And I think that's not insignificant. It really matters. And those five people and their families, it was obviously horribly tragic. But I think labeling it the Boston Massacre has to be one of the greatest examples of American revolutionary propaganda that I've ever heard.
Hmm.
Because the word, and maybe it was different in the 1770s, but the word today, to me, summons up a much bigger number. Like you said, it was like the idea that it might be under 100 would be weird. And it's actually much, much less than that. I think
Yeah,
that's just
yeah,
such a
yeah.
great example of how do we frame history, because, yeah, like it's still a big deal. But like when I heard that, I was like, wait, really? This is the massacre?
It is. It is funny that it's
Mm-hmm.
only five, but I think that the situation is similar, right? Like it is the governing body firing on civilians
Right.
was horrific to the people,
Yeah.
a surprise, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, this is a very dour subject, but I think it's an important one, and I'm glad we're having it, because you and I like dance around this, and we often
Mm-hmm.
disagree on some aspects, but we're centering in on like what we agree on,
Yeah.
and I enjoy that because it's important that we agree on certain things.
No, for sure, for sure. And I think this is like, because really, I mean, our podcast is media analysis. That is the fundamental thing we do, is try to say what are the lessons being taught, both good or bad, or ones that we agree with or don't agree with, by the media that we like to consume, and that a lot of our listeners hopefully like to consume. And I think taking a step back to talk about how do we do that media analysis, and how does the, you know, all the different things that come into play in terms of interpreting a piece of media, from the author and the to the person experiencing it, to the context in which it's written, to the context in which it is experienced at a totally different time. Um, like I want to give what I think is, to me, one of my favorite examples of the way a person in a different context can read a story fundamentally differently than the author's intent, but that still is very important, which is that, and again, this is one that comes to me from my time in seminary, and so forgive me for the biblical reference, but it's one I assume most people are familiar with. The story of Exodus, and of, according to the story, that God leads the Hebrew people out of Israel and into the land of Canaan, a land of milk and honey that is perfect for the people. And oh, by the way, they have to fight the Canaanites and drive those people out in order to claim the land, but it's their land that God has given them.
Hmm.
And there was a Native American, I believe part of the Sioux tribe, who was also a seminary educated and theologian and biblical scholar, who talked about how he read that story incredibly differently, because he
Right.
read it sympathizing with a person who had lived in a land of milk and honey, and then people had come thinking God gave it to them and driven his people out. And,
Yeah.
and, and it just utterly floored me, and that's why the professor shared it. I think it's, among kind of progressive biblical scholars, one of the most well remembered story. And I'll see if I can track down the name of it and the author for the show notes, because it's really a powerful essay. But yeah, to me, and that's, I'm not going to get into any discussion about who wrote the Bible, but clearly, whatever the people who brought those stories together and redacted it and turned it into what we now know as the Bible, that's not the intent they had. But it is, I think, a completely legitimate reading of the story from the experience that author had.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I mean, while you were telling the story, I was like, but what about the Canaanites?
Right?
Like that was the point of it.
Right?
And okay, so I have something that I've been thinking about regarding the Gorman in
Mm-hmm.
Star Wars. And so I was initially, or I was wrong about I mentioned the Battle of Algiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I have learned is that this is a movie from, I think, like the 60s
Yep.
that depicts these war of independence for Algeria from the French Empire, and the Battle of Algiers was like a major battle
Right.
in that. And I had read that the Gorman stuff was based on this. It actually seems like the Ferrix incident from season 1 is what
Mm.
they based a lot of the imagery of.
I can see that.
They based it on the Battle of Algiers movie.
Right.
But I still feel, I'm going to say, uncomfortable with the Gorman people, with the Frenchness of it. Like I think it's beautiful the way that they created a language that at moments sounded very French. I was like, are they speaking French? Like that was my first reaction, because I don't speak French, so I didn't recognize the words, but it sounded like it. and then finding out that many of the actors are French speaking actors, and
Hmm.
they created this language to kind of take advantage of their accents, right?
Right.
But again, it makes me uncomfortable that they are mostly white people, right? Like, did you feel that watching
So
it?
I did, but I wasn't uncomfortable because I think there's a specific meaning to it. And I may be projecting here,
Mm-hmm.
but I think they were intentional about that because I think what to me one of the things that again in my study of history, and this is the kind of thing that's only more recently being talked about, but a lot of people have been talking about how we learn about the French resistance in American high schools, often even American middle schools, is like that's one of the first things we learn about in terms of like the romantic fight against the Nazis. We maybe learn about the Warsaw Polish ghetto resort. We maybe learn about the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I'm using that word. That word obviously has a very specific meaning in America today, but I'm using it in the more traditional sense of the Jewish neighborhoods in Warsaw, and some non-Jewish for the poor. Um, but we don't talk at all about some of the other rebellions against the Nazis, especially in like in parts of Africa that the Italians and then the Nazis conquered, or in parts of Asia that they wound up going into as part of their conquer of the Russians. We hear much less about the Ukrainian resistance than we do the French.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I think it's intentional is that one of the things that they say in this season, it's towards the beginning, and so but I really noted it, was they talk about how the Empire is aware that if they oppress Gore, the nation of Gore, where the Gorman are from, or no, sorry, the people of the Gore, the nation's the planet's Gorman, that if they oppress them, that this is a world that the rest of the galaxy cares about, and
Mm-hmm.
so the rest of the galaxy is going to be much more interested and much more possibly they're going to have to do more to justify the oppression of Gorman than they might have had to do with Ferrex, for example. And so I think that
Yeah, I
them
remember
being white,
that.
I think them being white is intentional, but I also kind of wish they had done a little more to make that point front and center because I think you're right that it doesn't. And like, you know, in the first season, one thing we talked about was that Cassian Andor comes from a planet where they don't speak Galactic Basic, and that was the
Yeah,
first time we'd seen humans speaking non-galactic basic languages.
right.
And I do think there's with Gore and also with a couple of other planets get to have their own language in this. And I think there was kind of an interesting point they were making about indigeneity, and that Cassian's not from the only place that has indigenous people beyond the colonists and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But yeah, so I think that's always and just to further underline the point of how it being France, like the people are very artistic. They're all sort of their economy is built around this incredible silk that they get, and so there's the clothing manufacturer, and think about France today, but especially in the 1940s, is like really like the height of fashion and clothing. And also, if you note, a lot of the conversations happen as they're sipping coffee or caf, as they call it, in these little like street side cafes, which are
yeah,
very like emblematic of Paris culture in the 40s and 30s.
yeah. No, I mean, I got all that.
Yeah.
They talk about Gore being a proud people, right? And that's part of what's going on is like they're refusing to conform to imperial standards. Is what they're saying. And
Right.
I think that includes the language, and it is very powerful when the Gore sing that song like in
Yeah.
their native language, and it was beautiful. I cried. But again, like I'm just like, but they're white, right? Like the whole
Mm-hmm.
idea of like they're proud, they're wealthy, and that's why like the empire has to like have this propaganda campaign to like tear them down in the eyes of the other people of the empire. But they're white. Like I just
Yeah.
kept coming back to that, and it just kept bugging me because of the issue of Canary. Like in season one, that
Mm-hmm.
storyline was not very satisfying for a lot of
Yep.
people in its depictions and like how it ended up. And I I appreciate like what the Gilroys have created here. And I do think like my personal critique is like a lot of it's just too white.
Yeah.
Um but it's weird because like the main character, like Diego Luna, is,
Yep.
is not, and there are many like Bix, like Cinta, but I think I what I always say is like I want things to be better. And I
Yeah.
think like this is great. It is better than so much stuff. but I still want it to be better. I just want a little bit more. And like for me personally, right? Like the Japanese person, I think I got like zero representation of like Asians in this. And going into that Gorman arc, when they mentioned the Empire mentioned that they were bringing in Captain Kaido, I was like, oh, sweet, finally, like he's a
Yeah.
bad guy, but finally I'm gonna get a Japanese man, and
Yep.
he sure wasn't.
No, and I think that's very fair. And I think that I agree with you. And I think one of my favorite creators, person who's been on this show quite a lot, Danielle of Written in the Star Wars. If you follow her Twitter, her TikTok, she's talked a lot about the stuff you're talking about and some critiques she has, especially about the way Bix's story ends and things like that. And you know, you and I talked about how after in an earlier episode when a queer character dies, and I was like, I like a lot of this story, but I do feel like this is a little bit too much of the bury your queers aspect. And I think like
Mhm.
I am maybe more forgiving of the Gorman plot because I'm white in part, because I'm not as aware of it. And I'm glad you're bringing that up. Like I said, I think they made an intentional point. I don't think it was coincidental, but I wish they had highlighted it more. And if nothing else, like 1940s France was not all white by any means. Like there was a lot of African immigrants and things like that. Um, and so yeah, I think like we can say how good the show was, but we can also say these are some legit complaints or concerns, and that some of them have to do with the particular show, and some have to do with the tropes of of like cinema at this time and TV at this time, that how it falls doesn't fall into. And yeah, I think kind of pulling it all the way back then to answer your initial question, I feel like I was not originally not really comfortable with what they were doing with gore, and I think it makes sense if they are making a point that because Gore was primarily white, that the Empire cared about it more. But I wish they had done more to make that point clear, because I think without it being more, you know, lampshaded, the interpretation you have, I think, is completely valid.
Yeah, and where initially like I thought that this was based on the Battle of Algiers, like that is a the French Empire,
Yeah.
right? Being overthrown in an African country. And
Mm-hmm.
so like I thought that's where the parallel was, and I thought it was like a complete miss.
Yeah.
And then it's
I mean,
like, oh no, it's a little different. But still, like we know that they watched that movie and like
mm,
used elements of it. So they have that in their mind. And
mm-hmm.
so yeah, I was kind of like, well, what if it was just like Algerian French people?
Right.
Then you would have black people speaking French, a French dialect, right? Presumably.
I mean, I have heard. I think there was some intention to this during the Clone Wars shows, but certainly a lot since then. When people saw Gore as France, a comment I saw online a lot was, okay, if Gore is France, then Ryloth and Cham Syndulla are Algerian.
Ah,
That those
yeah,
are the
okay, there
Algerians.
you go. Well,
Cham,
yeah, like because the way
Cham,
Star Wars uses aliens
yeah, Cham
often.
Syndulla 100% has a French accent,
Yes,
and his daughter Hera, kind of we learn
code
that she code
switches.
switches out of it, but that's the accent she grew up with as well, and a lot of the Twi'leks and Ryloth have that accent. So
Yeah, yeah. Good point.
yeah. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. Riki, thank you so much for bringing this up to our members, our listeners. We'd love to know what you think, because it's an issue that's it's going to be at the core of how we go forward with so much of this podcast is how we interpret these things. So please let us know your thoughts. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Live long and prosper.
Ferrex.
Ferrex.